There is a moment in every storm when the people who laughed the hardest go the most quiet. When the wind stops being background noise and starts being something else entirely. When the cold stops being outside and starts being inside, creeping through the walls, through the floors, through every gap they never thought to seal because they never imagined needing to. That moment had a name in Granger Falls, Montana. People just didn't know it yet. They were too busy laughing at the man on the hill. Too busy calling his cabin paranoid. Too busy pointing at his thick walls and his buried generator, and his strange ventilation pipes, and his stacks of dry food sealed in the dark beneath the floor, and saying the same thing comfortable people always say about the man who prepares for what they refuse to imagine. They said he was broken. They said the war had followed him home and taken up permanent residence in his head. They said a man who builds a shelter like that in a peaceful valley is a man who never really left the battlefield. And then the ironback blizzard came down off the Montana Ridge on a Thursday night in December, and the power died, and the roads vanished, and the cold dropped to numbers that turned exposed skin into something fragile in under 2 minutes, and the town of Granger Falls discovered, house by house and family by family, that warmth was not a right. It was a preparation. This is the story of Caleb Merritt, a retired Navy SEAL. A man who said almost nothing while a whole town decided who he was. A man who dug beneath his cabin floor and stored food in the dark and ran air through walls that nobody understood, and never once explained himself, because the explanation lived in a place inside him that words could not reach. Stay with me. Because what happened inside those walls the night the blizzard came, what broke open, what was said, what a man and his dog and a room full of people who had mocked him discovered together in the dark, that is a story you will not forget. The town of Granger Falls sat in a long shallow valley between two ridges in the northern part of Montana, the kind of place where the mountains were always visible but never quite close enough to feel dangerous, where the winters were hard but familiar, and where the same families had been living on the same roads for so many generations that the names on the mailboxes matched the names on the headstones in the cemetery behind the old Lutheran church on the south end of Main Street. It was not a wealthy town, and it was not a famous town, and nothing had ever happened there that required the wider world to pay attention, and the people of Granger Falls had long since made their peace with that arrangement, and found it, on the whole, agreeable. The diner on the corner of Main and 3rd served breakfast at 6 in the morning and closed at 2 in the afternoon, and the coffee was strong, and the pie was reliable, and the conversations were the same conversations that had been happening in that building for 30 years. People knew the name of your dog and the year your roof was last replaced and the story behind the scar on your chin, and if you were new, they would find out those things eventually, and if you never became new, they would find out those things anyway, because that was simply the nature of a place where everyone's business was everyone's business and nobody had decided yet that this was a problem. The ridge to the northwest, locals called it the Ironback, for the way its rocky spine caught the winter light and turned dark and sharp against the sky, was the feature of the landscape that mattered most when December arrived. In good years, the Ironback funneled cold air south and the worst of the storms slid east before they reached the valley floor. In bad years, it acted as a ramp, accelerating the descending air until it hit the valley like something that had been building speed for 100 miles. The town absorbed it the way the town had always absorbed it, with good firewood, full pantries, and the patient resignation of people who understood that the mountain did not negotiate. In the 2 years before the winter that changed everything, the Ironback winters had been mild. Mild enough that people had begun relaxing in the particular way that comfortable people relax when danger has been absent long enough to seem theoretical. Mild enough that when a retired Navy SEAL named Caleb Merritt bought the 3-acre parcel on the east end of the valley and started building something on it that nobody in town recognized, the town's first reaction was not concern. It was laughter. Caleb Merritt had come back to Granger Falls in October, 2 years before the blizzard. He had grown up here, the son of a cattle rancher and a schoolteacher, and he had left at 19 with the quiet determination of a young man who had decided the world was larger than the valley he was born in and intended to find out exactly how large. He had spent 15 years finding out. The Navy had shaped him and the SEAL program had reshaped him, and the years of deployment that followed had done something that was visible in the way he moved through a room, the way his eyes tracked exits before they tracked faces, the way he could be standing in a crowd and somehow be located at the edge of it simultaneously, present and apart at the same time. He was 40 years old when he drove back into Granger Falls, and he carried himself with the quiet solidity of a man who had stopped needing the world's approval somewhere in his 30s and had found the experience clarifying. He was tall, broad across the shoulders and lean through the middle, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the surrounding peaks. His dark hair was cut close, his beard trimmed short and neat, and a faint pale scar ran along the ridge of his left eyebrow, a reminder of something he had never described to anyone in this valley. His eyes were a steady gray, calm and observant, the eyes of a man who had learned long ago that watching carefully before speaking was not a personality trait but a survival skill, and had never seen sufficient reason to unlearn it. Beside him, always, was a German shepherd named Dusk. Dusk was 4 years old, large and deep-chested, with a coat the color of a late evening sky, dark gray along his back, fading to warm ash-brown at his chest and legs, with amber eyes that held a stillness unusual even for the breed. He had served 2 tours as a military working dog in environments Caleb did not discuss, and the 2 of them had been together for 3 years through a veteran program that matched retired service dogs with former handlers. The people of Granger Falls would observe them over the following months and find themselves reaching, without quite knowing why, for words that existed outside the normal categories of man and pet. They moved as a unit. They communicated in silences. When Caleb was still, Dusk was still. When Caleb's attention shifted, Dusk's ears moved first, as if the dog was an extension of his senses rather than a separate creature occupying the same space. The land Caleb bought had been on the market for 3 years. The house that had previously stood there had burned down, the soil was rocky, the well needed work, and the access road turned to mud every spring thaw in a way that discouraged buyers. Caleb was not discouraged. He looked at the parcel twice, both times on foot with Dusk beside him, and both times he stood for a long while at the north edge of the property studying the iron-back ridge and the way the wind moved through the valley below it. The second time, he took a small notebook from his jacket pocket, made notes that nobody else saw, and made an offer at asking price that afternoon. He began building the following week. The foundation went in first, and people noticed it was unusually deep, deeper than county code required, set into the rocky hillside in a way that suggested the structure above was expected to face forces that ordinary houses in Granger Falls had not been designed to resist. Then the walls went up, and the walls were what started the real conversations. They were thick. Not normal house thick. An outer course of structural lumber, then 6 inches of dense pack insulation, then an interior course of tongue-and-groove pine, the whole assembly nearly 14 inches deep from outside face to inside face. Carl Dorset, who ran the lumberyard and had been supplying construction materials in the valley for 25 years, watched the insulation orders move through his books and told his wife that the man on the east end was building either a house or a vault, and he wasn't entirely certain which. Steel storm shutters appeared over every window, the exterior mount type rated for extreme wind loads, fitted with mechanical locking bars operated from inside. A backup generator arrived on a flatbed, a commercial grade unit of the kind used by hospitals, and Caleb spent 4 days digging a reinforced concrete housing for it beside the cabin's north wall. A massive cast-iron wood stove went in at the center of the main room, connected to a double-wall insulated chimney. And then, on a cold morning in late November, Caleb opened a section of the cabin floor and began digging downward. He was down there for weeks. People driving past on the east road would slow down and watch the mound of displaced soil growing beside the cabin, and Dusk sitting on top of it with the calm of a creature standing guard over something valuable that the passing humans did not yet understand. What Caleb was building beneath the floor was a reinforced underground storage room, steel-lined, concrete floor, walls extending 4 feet into bedrock. The ventilation system alone took 2 weeks to design and install, a passive air circulation network drawing fresh air from a surface intake behind the treeline, filtering it, distributing it through PVC ducts, exhausting it through a separate stack on the cabin's east wall. Gravity-driven. No power required. In a complete electrical failure, it would continue moving clean air through the space indefinitely. The supplies he moved into that cellar were not the modest reserves of a man preparing for a week of bad weather. They were the carefully organized inventory of a man who had calculated, with military precision, how many people might need to survive in this space and for how long. Sealed 5-gallon buckets of dry rice, beans, oats, and cornmeal. Commercial quantity canned goods on steel shelving bolted to the walls. Vacuum-sealed dried meat and fish. Medical supplies in labeled cases, bandages, antiseptics, trauma kits, fever and infection medications, a full set of field medical tools of the kind carried in special operations packs. 300 gallons of water in rigid military-grade containers. Wool blankets sealed in plastic. 30 days of firewood stacked in the alcove beneath the north wall. A hand-crank emergency radio. A weather station feeding data to a display beside the front door. A transfer switch that would route generator power to every circuit in the building within 4 seconds of a grid failure. The town of Granger Falls looked at all of this and reached a unanimous verdict. The man was broken. The war had followed him home. He was building for a disaster that lived only in his damaged imagination. The loudest voice in that verdict belonged to Roy Dalton, who owned the hardware store on Main Street and had the booming confidence of a man whose opinions had rarely been contradicted by events. Roy was in his early 50s, broad and loud, with a square red face and a gray beard trimmed to a sharp line and a laugh that carried through walls. He was not a cruel man exactly, but he found the gap between how things were supposed to be and how some people chose to be them to be an inexhaustible source of entertainment. He began calling the cabin the Iron Box, and the name spread through the diner and the gas station and the feed store with a speed that mean little nicknames always travel in small towns, which is immediately and completely, and within 2 weeks people were using it who had never heard Roy say it. His most regular audience gathered at the hardware store counter every weekday morning. Pete Shumway from the grain elevator, Gary Finch the rancher, and Dennis Waite who drove the county road truck and had the philosophical outlook of a man who fixed what other forces broke and had developed from this a low opinion of anything that claimed to be permanent. These 4 men formed the informal committee of opinion in Granger Falls, and their opinion of Caleb Merritt was consistent. He had spent too many years in the military. He had carried too much home. He was building for a storm that would never come. The dog, they all agreed, was extremely well behaved. There was one person in Granger Falls who did not share this opinion without complication. Her name was Nora Vance. She was 38, and she ran the small medical clinic on Pine Street, a 2-room practice serving the valley for everything from winter flu to farm injuries. She had dark red hair she kept pulled back during work hours and wore loose in the evenings, and her eyes were a pale, clear green, the color of river ice in early spring, with the focused quality of someone who had trained herself to look at things carefully before deciding what they were. She had moved to Granger Falls 7 years earlier from a hospital emergency room in Missoula, drawn to the valley by a quality of winter light she had encountered once on a drive-through and could not entirely explain. She lived behind the clinic with a large orange tabby named Birch. She had never married. She was, by the general consensus of the valley, both indispensable and quietly unknowable, a combination Granger Falls had accepted because the first quality outweighed the second by enough to make the arrangement work. Nora had driven past Caleb's cabin twice during construction and had stopped once, on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was flat white and the wind carried the metallic edge she associated with incoming cold. She had sat in her truck at the end of the access road and studied the structure, the walls, the shutters, the generator housing, the ventilation stack. She had watched dusk on the soil mound, the dog's amber eyes finding her immediately and holding her gaze with a stillness that felt less like a dog watching a stranger and more like something making a careful and serious assessment. She had driven on without speaking to Caleb. But she had not dismissed what she had seen, because her profession had taught her that the space between what something looked like and what it actually was could be the most consequential space in any situation, and she had learned to be careful about which side of that space she stood on before she formed a conclusion. What none of them knew. What Caleb had never told anyone in Granger Falls and had no intention of telling anyone, because the telling produced a pale version of the thing that did not honor what the thing had actually been, was the reason behind all of it. The reason had a specific beginning. It had begun 6 years earlier on a January night in the Absarika Range, an extraction operation in a remote location that had gone wrong in ways that were not anyone's fault and could not have been predicted with the information they had carried into the mountains. There had been 5 of them. They had had a window of clear weather that closed in 40 minutes, And what replaced it was not the storm they had prepared for, but the storm the mountain had decided to produce, which was a different thing entirely. The temperature dropped to -38 degrees in under 2 hours. The snow did not fall, it existed, a total white environment that removed direction and distance and replaced them with wind and cold so extreme that exposed skin began losing sensation in 90 seconds and began dying in 4. The radio signal was flat static. Rescue was impossible. The entire region was locked under the same system and nothing moved in any direction. Dusk, younger than, barely a year out of his training, had crawled under Caleb during the worst hours of the night and held body heat against him with the generosity of a creature who understood at some level below language that the human beside him needed to survive. In the morning, Caleb was alive. His 4 teammates were not. There had been no negligence found. No failure of command. No equipment failure. The storm had simply been larger and faster and colder than the category assigned to storms in that region. The men had been prepared for what storms there usually were. They had not been prepared for what that storm actually was. Caleb had written 4 letters to 4 families. He had attended 4 services. He had spent a year in a silence so complete that the Navy had eventually suggested, gently, that his service was perhaps at a natural end. He had agreed. He had come home to Granger Falls. And he had built the cabin the way he had built it because he had learned, at a cost he could not speak about without tearing something that he had chosen to keep closed, that preparation was not paranoia and that storms did not negotiate, and that the difference between a shelter and a building was whether it had been designed for the storm it was actually going to face. On the morning of November 15th, the National Weather Service issued its first advisory. A winter storm watch for the mountain counties of northern Montana, with language about potentially historic accumulations in valley systems. By noon it had been upgraded to a warning. By 2 in the afternoon, the lead meteorologist from the Billings office was on local radio describing what the models had converged on, a slow-moving low that would park itself over the northern Rockies for 36 to 48 hours, drawing Arctic air south at a rate not recorded in this region in 40 years. Wind speeds in exposed mountain valleys exceeding 70 miles per hour. Temperature projections of -25 to -35 at valley floor level. Wind chills approaching -60. Snowfall accumulations of 4 to 6 feet in 48 hours. At the diner, 2 customers heard the broadcast and said the forecasters always overdid it. Old Margaret Pruitt, who was 81 and had more seasons of ironback winters in her body than anyone still living in the valley, set her coffee cup down carefully and said, quietly, that she did not think they were overdoing it this time. At the hardware store, Roy read the bulletin mid-morning and managed his discomfort the way he always managed it, which was by expressing more confidence, not less. The forecasters get paid whether they're right or wrong, he said to Dennis Waite. Dennis nodded but did not laugh the way he usually laughed, and Roy noticed this and did not mention it. By mid-afternoon on the 17th, the sky had changed. The flat winter white deepened into something darker and purposeful, a color that held blue and green and something without a name that the older ranchers recognized from the few times they had seen it before and described, when pressed, as the color the light gets when the mountain has made a decision. The wind had shifted out of the northwest. No longer exploratory gusts but a sustained directional force, a continuous pressure against every north-facing surface, bending the tops of the pines along the ridge into a permanent lean. The temperature had been dropping since noon without reversal, which was the detail that mattered most. The drop that did not reverse meant the cold was not coming ahead of the storm. It was the storm. At 4 o'clock, the first power line went down on the North Road, and the lights in 6 houses went out simultaneously. 30 minutes later, the temperature inside those houses began its first serious fall. At the cabin on the East Road, Caleb had already locked every storm shutter. The wood stove had been running at full output since noon. The generator was armed on standby. The cellar hatch was open, warming the underground room from the cabin's heat. Dusk was inside. Everything was ready. Everything had been ready for 2 days. Caleb sat in the wooden chair beside the stove with the oil lamp burning steady on the table, and he listened to the wind finding its first serious voice against the outside of the building, and the walls absorbed it, and the cabin held, and Dusk lay on the rug with his amber eyes open and watching the door. Outside, in the valley below, the lights of Granger Falls flickered once at 6 o'clock, and then they went out entirely, all of them, in the space of 4 seconds, and the darkness that replaced them was the darkness of a mountain valley in a blizzard at 6 in the evening in December, a darkness with weight and temperature, and a quality of completeness that the people of Granger Falls had never experienced at precisely this depth before. Inside their homes, the stored heat began its surrender to the cold. The furnaces that needed power became sculptures. The baseboard heaters became cold metal. And the people of Granger Falls began, one by one, to understand that the warmth they had always assumed would be there when they needed it was a thing that had to be built before the storm arrived, not during it, and not after. At the clinic on Pine Street, Nora Vance was already putting on her coat. She loaded 3 cases of medical supplies into a duffel bag, turned off the last oil lamp, and went out the back door into the blizzard. The wind hit her sideways and she corrected her footing and walked toward the east road with her head down, counting her steps, holding in her mind the single fact she had fixed there before she stepped out, that the east road was a quarter-mile ahead, and the cabin was 3/4 of a mile down it, and in one of the shuttered windows there was a light that had been burning all day and was not going out. She found the east road by the change in the ground under her boots. She turned right. She walked through the white totality of the storm with the wind screaming at her left shoulder and the hillside rising to her right. At the second bend she turned left onto the access road and followed the change in surface through the dark toward the amber glow visible through the gap in the shutters, warm, steady, alive with a fire that had been established long before anyone needed it. She climbed the 3 steps and knocked. She counted. She reached 3, and the door opened, and the warmth and the light that poured from the opening were so immediate and so complete after the dark and the cold that she made a sound she had not planned to make. Caleb looked at her for 1 second with the assessing calm of a man who had spent a career reading situations in their first moments. Then he stepped back. "Nora Vance," he said quietly. "Come in." She came in. Dusk rose from the rug and approached her with the careful, measured greeting of a large dog who understood exactly how large he was. She set her medical bag on the table. She looked around the room, at the thick walls, the steady stove, the organized quiet of everything in it, and she understood with the full clarity of a person confronting the distance between what they had assumed and what was actually true, that she was standing in the only place in Granger Falls that had been built for exactly this night. Neither of them spoke about that. Caleb moved a second chair to the stove. Nora asked how many people the cellar could hold. He told her. They both looked at the door. They did not wait long. The first knock came at 8:47. The first knock came at 8:47, and it was not a polite knock. It was the knock of someone who had used up everything that was not essential and had arrived at the door with only what remained, which was the need to be somewhere warm before the cold finished what it had started. Caleb crossed the room in 4 steps and opened the door, and the wind came in first, a hard, physical blast that sent snow spiraling across the pine floor and pushed the flame in the oil lamp sideways, and behind the wind stood Roy Dalton. Roy, who had coined the name Ironbox. Roy, who had laughed the loudest and longest and most publicly of anyone in Granger Falls. He was coated in snow from his shoulders to his boots, his gray beard crusted with ice, his square red face pale in a way that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with the particular humility of a man who has been wrong about something that mattered. He was breathing hard. His eyes moved from Caleb's face to the interior of the cabin, to the warm amber light, to the steady orange glow of the stove, to Nora Vance sitting in the chair beside it with her hands wrapped around a tin mug, and something shifted in his expression that was not quite shame and not quite relief but held elements of both, compressed together by the cold and the dark into something that had no clean name. He said nothing for a moment. The wind pressed against his back and pushed him slightly forward on the step. Caleb looked at him for 1 second, the same assessing second he had given Nora, and then he stepped aside. "Come in," he said. The same 2 words. No more and no less. Roy came in. Dusk approached him with the measured calm of a dog who had decided the stranger was not a threat, sniffed the ice on his coat, and then returned to his place beside the stove. Roy stood in the middle of the room and looked at his hands for a moment, the way a man looks at his hands when the rest of him does not know what to do. Then he looked at Caleb. "I came to see if you needed anything," Roy said, and even as the words left his mouth he understood how they sounded, and his jaw tightened once, and he looked at the floor. Caleb said nothing to that. He took Roy's coat from his shoulders and hung it near the stove to dry, and he handed him a tin mug of hot water with dry ginger in it, and he pointed him toward the bench along the north wall, and Roy sat down and held the mug and stared into it, and said nothing else for a long time. Nora watched this from her chair with the quiet, clinical attention of a woman who had spent years reading what people could not say in the words they chose, and what she read in Roy Dalton in that moment was not the man who had named the cabin the Iron Box. It was the man underneath that man, the one the confidence and the loudness had been sitting on top of, a man who was more frightened than he had ever allowed himself to appear, and who was now, in the warmth of a room he had mocked into existence, beginning the slow and uncomfortable process of understanding what that meant. The second knock came 12 minutes later. This time it was a family, Joel and Karen Marsh and their 2 children, a boy of about 9 named Sam and a girl of 6 named Lily, who was wearing 2 coats and holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear with the focused grip of a child who has decided that this object is non-negotiable regardless of circumstances. Joel was a carpenter in his mid-30s, lean and dark-haired, with the wind-burned skin of a man who worked outdoors in all seasons. His wife Karen was small and pale with light brown hair frozen at the ends, her eyes carrying the particular expression of a mother who has been frightened on behalf of her children and has not yet been given permission to stop being frightened. Their furnace had quit within an hour of the power failing, and they had burned through their fireplace wood in 3 hours attempting to keep 2 small children warm in a house that was losing heat through walls that had not been built to resist what the ironback was currently delivering to the valley floor. Joel had wrapped both children in every blanket they owned and put them in the truck, and the truck had started, barely, and he had driven the east road by feel and by the grace of 4-wheel drive and pure desperate attention until the access road appeared on his left, and he had turned up it and stopped in front of the cabin and gotten both children out and carried Lily the last 50 yards himself because her small boots were not equal to the drift depth and he was not willing to find out what the cold would do to small feet in insufficient boots. Caleb opened the door before they knocked. He had heard the truck. He had Dusk beside him and a wool blanket in his hands, and when Lily came through the door, he wrapped the blanket around her without ceremony and pointed Karen toward the stove and told Joel where the second supply of dry wood was stacked in the alcove if he wanted to bring in another armful. Joel stared at him for a moment, the look of a man who has been in survival mode for 3 hours and has just encountered something that is not the emergency he was expecting, and then he nodded once and went to get the wood, because having something to do with his hands was exactly what he needed, and Caleb had apparently understood this without being told. Lily sat on the rug beside Dusk and put her stuffed rabbit in front of the dog's nose by way of introduction. Dusk lowered his great head and sniffed the rabbit with the dignified seriousness of a dog who understood that this was an important social gesture and responded to it accordingly. Lily decided on the basis of this interaction that Dusk was trustworthy, and she leaned against his side and he remained still, radiating warmth in the particular way that a large dog radiates warmth, which is generous and total and without condition. Sam sat on the bench beside Roy Dalton and looked around the cabin with the wide-eyed attention of a 9-year-old who was processing the fact that this was, by any measure, the most interesting place he had ever been inside. Roy looked at the boy and then looked at his mug again. He opened his mouth once and then closed it. Sam looked at him with the uncomplicated curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to perform indifference. "How come it's so warm in here?" Sam asked. Roy considered the question with more seriousness than it technically required. "Because he built it right," Roy said finally. His voice was quiet. Not the voice he used at the hardware store counter. Something underneath that voice. Sam accepted this and looked at the stove. Outside, the blizzard pressed its full argument against the walls, and the walls received it and held. By 10 o'clock, 7 more people had arrived. Dennis Waite came with his wife Eleanor and her elderly mother, a small, silver-haired woman named Frances who had lived in the valley for 60 years and who walked into the cabin and looked around with the calm recognition of someone who had been waiting to see something like this and was not surprised to find it here, on this hill, built by this particular man. Pete Shumway arrived alone, his grain elevator locked and dead, and his house on the North Road, already below 40 degrees inside, when he had finally accepted the math of the situation and left. Gary Finch came with his neighbor, a young woman named Becca Crane who had moved to the valley the previous spring and who was, of the people gathered in the cabin that night, the only one who had never once laughed at Caleb Merritt or called his cabin by the name Roy had invented for it, because she had not been there long enough to know that laughing at him was the expected thing. She came in and looked at the cabin, and at the organized rows of supplies on the shelves, and at the steady fire, and the ventilation pipes, and the weather station display beside the door. And she said, quietly and without embarrassment, "This is extraordinary." Nobody disagreed with her. Caleb moved through the room with the unhurried efficiency of someone managing a situation rather than reacting to one, checking on the generator every 40 minutes, monitoring the stove output, making sure the smaller children were warm and the elderly were comfortable and the adults had something useful to occupy their hands and their attention. He distributed wool blankets from the cellar storage in an order that reflected clear priority. Children first, then the elderly, then the adults, without announcing the logic of it or making anyone feel the logic of it, which was a skill that Nora recognized from emergency medicine, the skill of organizing chaos without letting the people inside the chaos know they are being organized. He opened the cellar at 10:30 and began bringing up food. Canned soup heated on the propane camp burner on the kitchen counter. Hard crackers and peanut butter. Dried fruit. Rice cooked in a cast-iron pot on the stovetop. Hot water for tea. For Frances, the elderly mother who had been in the valley for 60 years, he found in the back of his cabinet a bottle of good whiskey, and he poured a small measure into a tin cup and set it in front of her without comment. She looked at him with sharp, clear eyes, and then she looked at the cup, and then she picked it up and drank it with the dignified appreciation of a woman who had earned the right to accept warmth in whatever form it arrived. The room settled into the particular quiet of people who have survived something together and are not yet ready to speak about it directly but are speaking about everything else. The children, the food, the dog, the storm sounds against the walls, the question of what the valley would look like when the light came back. Dusk moved through the room at intervals, checking on each person with the calm systematic attention of a creature who had been assigned a responsibility and took it seriously, pausing beside the children for longer than he paused beside the adults, as if he understood that the smallest people in the room had the least capacity to regulate their own temperature and required the most supplemental warmth. It was Dennis Waite who first said it out loud. Dennis, who had the philosophical disposition of a man who spent his days fixing broken roads, sat on the bench near the east wall with Eleanor beside him and Frances asleep in the good chair near the stove, and he looked at the thick pine walls and the ventilation pipes and the organized shelves and the transfer switch panel beside the door, and he said, not dramatically but with the honest simplicity of a man stating a fact that had been sitting in the room waiting for someone to say it, he planned for exactly this. Nobody argued. Roy looked up from his mug. Gary Finch studied his hands. Pete Shumway stared at the floor with the expression of a man replaying a series of conversations he would have conducted differently had he known what he now knew. Joel Marsh was putting Sam to bed on the folded blankets in the corner, and he paused and looked toward Caleb, who was at the kitchen counter refilling the water pot, his back to the room. Joel watched him for a moment. He said nothing. But the watching said what the words would have said. Around midnight, the storm reached what the Weather Service would later describe as its peak intensity. The wind hit speeds that nobody in Granger Falls had ever recorded, a sustained roaring that found every note in the cabin's exterior, the gap at the generator conduit, the edge of the chimney baffle, the corner where the north wall met the hillside, and played them all simultaneously, a sound that had more in common with a physical force than with weather. The temperature outside had dropped to negative 29 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind chill was somewhere the instruments did not agree on, somewhere past negative 50, somewhere in the range of numbers that meant something different when you understood them as a fact about the human body rather than as a figure on a scale. Inside the cabin, the stove held at full output, and the generator ran clean, and the walls absorbed what the storm delivered, and the thermometer on the interior wall read 67 degrees, the same it had read since early afternoon, steady and unchanging as a thing that had been built to be exactly what it was. Roy Dalton sat on the north bench with his empty mug between his palms and stared at the floor, and then looked up at Caleb, who had settled into the wooden chair beside the stove with his hands around his own mug and Dusk's head resting on his knee. The room was mostly asleep around them. The children on their blankets. Frances in her chair. Karen Marsh with her head on Joel's shoulder. The firelight moved on the walls in slow, warm patterns. Roy looked at Caleb for a long moment. Caleb looked back at him with the steady gray eyes that Roy had always found, when he was honest with himself, slightly uncomfortable. Roy cleared his throat. "I want to say something," Roy said. Caleb waited. "I called this place the Iron Box," Roy said. "I said it in front of people, and I said it more than once, and I made sure it stuck, and I want you to know I understand what that cost and I'm sorry for it." He paused. The fire popped once in the stove. Dusk's ear turned toward the sound and returned to rest. Roy looked at the walls. At the thick, engineered 14-inch walls that were currently standing between every person in this room and a storm that would kill them in under 4 minutes outside. "I was wrong about what you were doing," Roy said. "And I think I knew I was wrong before I admitted it, and I kept saying it anyway because it was comfortable and because I was the man who had said it first, and walking it back felt like losing something." His voice had lost the carry. It was a smaller voice than the one he usually used, but more honest than the one he usually used, and the room was quiet enough that it reached everyone in it, including the people who were pretending to be asleep and weren't. Caleb looked at him for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "You let people in when they needed it." Roy frowned slightly. "You came here," Caleb said. "You knocked on the door, and you came in, and then you moved over on the bench when the Marsh family arrived, and you talked to the boy when he needed someone to talk to. That's what matters tonight." Roy stared at him. His jaw moved once. He looked back at the fire. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, the warmth held. Roy nodded slowly, the nod of a man receiving something he had not expected and did not entirely know what to do with but understood was important. He said nothing else. He looked at the fire for a long time, and the fire looked back at him, and the cabin held everything inside it without apology. Nora Vance was awake through most of the night. She had checked on Francis twice, taken Sam's temperature when he coughed in his sleep and found it normal, cleaned a cut on Joel's hand from where he had caught it on the storm shutter latch during the drive. Around 2 in the morning, when the wind had begun its first tentative reduction from peak fury to merely relentless, she sat in her chair and watched Caleb make a slow circuit of the room, checking the generator, adjusting the stove damper, refilling the water pot, moving through the space with the same unhurried precision he had shown since the moment she arrived. She had been thinking about something since 9 o'clock, and around 2 in the morning she decided to say it. She waited until he had returned to his chair, and the room had settled back into its sleeping quiet. She said, quietly enough not to wake anyone, "You built this for them, didn't you?" Caleb looked at her. "Not for yourself," Nora said. "You built it for the people who would need it." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at Dusk, who had lifted his head at the sound of the conversation, and was watching them both with amber eyes that held, as always, more understanding than the situation seemed to require. Then Caleb said, "I built it because I knew what happened when a place wasn't ready." He paused. "I wasn't going to let that happen here." Nora looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 4 letters he had written. She did not know about the 4 letters, but she felt the shape of them in the way he had said that sentence. The weight behind it, the specific gravity of a man carrying something that had not diminished with time but had been converted, over years of quiet work, into something useful. She said, "I think they'll understand that someday." He nodded once, slowly, in the way of a man acknowledging a thing that was true. Dusk put his head back on his paws. Outside, the ironback blizzard continued its long argument with the valley, and the cabin stood in the middle of it, warm and certain and entirely unchanged. The wind began dropping at 4 in the morning. Not quickly. Great storms do not relinquish themselves quickly. They unwind from their peak in the way that a long tension unwinds, gradually and with occasional reversals, the roaring descending by degrees through loud and then present and then, by 6:30 in the morning, merely the cold wind of a December dawn in a valley that had just survived something historic. The snow had stopped sometime around 3. What it left behind was 4 feet of undisturbed white across every open surface in the valley, and drifts of 6 and 8 feet along the north faces of buildings and tree lines, and a silence of the particular quality that follows a storm of this size. A silence that had weight and texture. A silence made of the absence of the roaring that had been present for 12 hours, so that the quiet itself felt like a sound. Caleb was at the door first, dusk beside him, both of them stepping out into a world that had been reorganized in the night. The air was still and extremely cold, the sky a pale, washed blue above the white valley, the Ironback Ridge standing sharp and dark against it. The lights were out across Granger Falls below. Several rooflines showed the dark geometry of collapse or damage. Power lines lay across the snow on the north road. But the cabin behind him stood entirely intact, every shutter sound, every seal holding, the generator idling in its concrete housing with the steady competence of something built to do exactly what it was doing. They came out through the morning in groups, families and neighbors making their way from the cabin steps down the access road toward the valley below, each of them pausing at the bottom of the path in the particular way that people pause when they are leaving a place that has meant something they had not expected it to mean. Frances walked out on Dennis Waite's arm, her silver hair neat beneath her wool hat, and she looked back at the cabin from the path and nodded once with a slow, satisfied nod of a woman who had seen enough of the world to recognize a right thing when she finally stood inside it. The Marsh children ran into the snow at the bottom of the access road and immediately sank to their waists, and Sam emerged laughing and Lily emerged furious, and Karen Marsh laughed for the first time in 14 hours, a Rayall laugh, sudden and unguarded, and the sound of it moved across the white valley with a clarity that the open cold air carried without diminishing.